They smirked as they cut my $98,000 salary down to $38,000, assuming I'd have no option but to comply. My director was left speechless when I gave him a letter. He didn't realize I'd just landed a role with his top rival that paid twice as much. He gaped in horror at his company's death warrant. Can you believe someone would look you dead in the eye after years of your blood, sweat, and breakthroughs and tell you your entire worth is suddenly a third of what it was? It wasn't just a pay cut, it was a declaration of war. They thought they'd broken me, but what they didn't know was I was already building my own empire. You're cutting my salary to $38,000. I said it out loud, loud enough that every single head in that sterile conference room snapped toward me. It was like I'd just confessed to murder. But Grayson Turner? He didn't even flinch. Not one bit. He just sat there, fingers steepled like some corporate Buddha, watching me try to digest a number that had just utterly shattered my life. $98,000 a year. Down to $38,000. That wasn't a pay cut. That was a financial execution by spreadsheet. The paper lay in front of me like a death warrant. Organizational restructuring, the header read, with my name typed neatly below. Grayson's voice, smooth as a scalpel, sliced through the silence. It's company-wide, Dakota. Nothing personal. Nothing personal? Oh, believe me, it was personal. Why else were 3 other department heads being handed generous severance packages while I was being financially waterboarded? Why had my lab access been temporarily restricted 2 months ago? Why did my project budgets keep getting slashed without a single explanation? My hand just froze. I couldn't bring myself to reach for that paper. I just stared at it, convinced it might just spontaneously combust if I looked hard enough. Then some suit from corporate finance, I swear I never even learned his name, chimed in. The market is shifting. We need to realign our resources with current revenue streams. Translation? Asterisk, we're bleeding money, and someone has to take the hit. That someone is you, Dakota. Asterisk, my name is Dakota Pierce. I'm 36 years old, single, and I live in this converted warehouse loft in downtown Portland. For the past 7 years, I'd been a lead materials engineer at Brightstone Dynamics, a mid-sized company that makes industrial adhesives and sealants. You know, the kind of stuff that holds bridges together and keeps airplane wings from falling off. And here's the kicker. I was also the reason their revenue had doubled in the last 3 years. Let me think about it, I said, pushing back from the table. Grayson's eyebrows arched like I'd just suggested we sacrifice a goat to the quarterly reports. This isn't really a negotiation, Dakota. We're hoping you'll see this as an opportunity to what? Pay my mortgage with good intentions? The room went utterly silent. You could literally hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and started toward the door. Where are you going? Grayson called after me. I paused, my hand on the doorknob. I looked back at him, pretending to calculate whether I wanted to work for 40% of what I was worth, or find somewhere that actually valued what I bring to the table. That was a lie. I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I'd been plotting this moment for 6 months. The signs had been everywhere. Budget meetings I wasn't invited to, projects reassigned without explanation, equipment orders left unapproved. My research assistants were even temporarily moved to other departments. But the real giveaway? 3 weeks ago. I caught Grayson and the VP of Operations, Bradley Holt, huddled over printouts of my lab notes in the break room. They scattered like roaches when they saw me. But I knew what I'd witnessed. They were scheming. They were trying to push me out and steal my work. That was their first mistake. I drove straight home in my battered Honda Civic, parked in the alley behind my building, and took the freight elevator up to the 8th floor. My loft wasn't much to look at: exposed brick, industrial lighting, furniture scavenged from estate sales. But it had 2 things that mattered: space and privacy. The real action happened in the back room, behind the kitchen. Most people would call it a storage area. I called it my insurance policy. I'd been working nights and weekends in that makeshift lab for 3 years, long before Grayson decided I was disposable. Old equipment I'd picked up at auctions. Chemicals purchased with my own money. Notebooks packed with formulas that existed nowhere else in the world. The breakthrough that changed everything came on a Tuesday night in February. I'd been trying to solve a problem that had stumped industrial chemists for decades: how to create structural adhesives that could cure at sub-zero temperatures without losing their bond strength. Most industrial glues need heat to set. Great for a climate-controlled factory, but a nightmare if you're repairing an oil pipeline in Alaska or fixing a wind turbine in a Montana winter. I tried everything. Different polymer chains, alternative catalysts, modified curing agents. Nothing. Absolutely nothing worked. Until I stumbled on what my old chemistry professor would have called a happy accident. I was cleaning up after another failed test when I knocked over a beaker of experimental solvent into a batch of epoxy resin I'd been working on. Instead of ruining the mixture, it produced something entirely new. A gel that stayed workable at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, yet formed molecular bonds stronger than traditional adhesives at room temperature. I spent the next 4 months perfecting the formula, testing it on everything from metal joints to composite panels, running stress tests that would make aerospace engineers envious. By the time I was done, I had something that could revolutionize cold weather construction and emergency repairs. The catch? I developed it entirely on my own time, with my own resources. And I'd been smart enough to document everything. The morning after Grayson's salary ambush, I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. Elena Rodriguez, a patent attorney who specialized in intellectual property theft. She had a reputation for being utterly ruthless when it came to protecting her clients' work. "How solid is your documentation?" she asked after I explained the situation. "Time-stamped video of every major test," I told her. "Purchase receipts for all materials, lab notes with dates and signatures, even photos of my setup to prove it was separate from the company facility." "What about non-compete clauses?" she asked. I pulled out my employment contract and flipped to page 7. Standard 2-year non-compete, but it only covered direct employment with competitors. Said nothing about licensing my own patents. Elena was quiet for a moment. I could hear her typing in the background. "How fast can you file? How fast do you need?" I shot back. "Yesterday would be good. Tomorrow's the absolute latest." She laughed. A genuine laugh. "I like your style. Send me everything. We'll have provisional patents filed by the close of business today." That afternoon, I sat in my home lab, surrounded by 3 years of work that Brightstone Dynamics didn't even know existed. The cold cure adhesive was just the start. I had formulas for impact-resistant sealants, temperature-stable compounds, and a revolutionary coating that could shield metal from corrosion in salt water. Hundreds of hours of research and development. Thousands of dollars in materials and equipment. All mine. All documented. All about to become legally untouchable. My phone rang. "Elena, we're filing 4 provisional patents under your name, Dakota. The cold cure formula is the crown jewel, but the others are solid, too. You'll have full protection within 24 hours. "What about Brightstone?" I asked. "They'll claim I used company resources." "Let them try," she said, a hint of steel in her voice. "Your documentation is cleaner than a surgical suite. They'll have to prove you used their equipment or their time. And from what I can see, you've got enough evidence to bury that argument in court." I hung up and walked to the window overlooking the Portland skyline. Brightstone Dynamics occupied a glass tower about 5 miles east of my building. From where I stood, it looked small enough to flick away with my finger. They thought they had me cornered. Thought I'd accept their insulting offer because I needed the steady paycheck. Thought I was just another expendable engineer who'd built their career on someone else's foundation. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The next morning, I put on my best suit and drove back to Brightstone for what I figured would be my final employee meeting. Grayson had requested a follow-up conversation to discuss my future with the company. The conference room was smaller this time. Just him, Bradley Holt, and some woman from HR I'd never met. "Dakota, thanks for coming in," Grayson said as I sat down. "I know yesterday was a lot to process. Have you had time to think about our offer?" Our offer, as if it were some generous gift, instead of financial assassination. "I have," I said, and a slow smile spread across my face. "And I've got a counterproposal." Bradley leaned forward, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "We're not really in a position to negotiate salary adjustments right now. The budget constraints are. I pulled out a manila envelope and placed it on the table between us. This isn't about salary. The room went silent. Grayson stared at the envelope like it might explode. What's that? The HR woman finally asked. I opened the envelope and spread 4 patent applications across the table, like I was dealing cards in a high-stakes poker game. Licensing agreements for proprietary formulas I developed independently. The cold cure adhesive alone is worth about $50 million in annual revenue once it hits the market. Grayson picked up one of the documents, his face paling as he read the technical specifications. You can't. These were developed using company resources. Company time. I smiled. A real, genuine, satisfying smile. Actually, no. Every single test was conducted in my private lab, using materials I purchased myself. All development happened outside of work hours. I've got video documentation going back 3 years. Bradley grabbed another sheet, his eyes wide. This is the sub-zero bonding compound. We've been trying to develop something like this for 7 years. And I finished it, I said, my voice calm. I know, because I've been working on it for Brightstone that entire time, with zero progress using your equipment and timeline. Turns out the real breakthrough required a different approach. One that needed work outside the constraints of your budget committees and approval processes. The HR woman looked utterly bewildered. I don't understand. Are you saying you want to license these patents to the company? That's exactly what I'm saying, I affirmed. Exclusive licensing rights for all 4 formulas. $50,000 per month per patent. That's $200,000 monthly. Paid on the 1st of each month, starting immediately. The silence stretched. Maybe 10 seconds. It felt like an eternity. Then Grayson finally found his voice. That's almost $2.5 million a year. Correct. You're insane if you think we'd pay that much for her. Bradley started, his voice rising. I held up my hand, cutting him off. Let me save you some time. The cold cure adhesive I developed will capture about 60% of the emergency repair market within 2 years. Conservative estimates put that at $75 million in annual revenue. The corrosion-resistant coating will revolutionize marine construction. The impact-resistant sealant will become the new standard for aerospace applications. I leaned back in my chair, enjoying their horrified expressions. $2.5 million is a bargain compared to what these formulas will generate. And that's assuming you can even develop competing products, which you can't, because I own the underlying chemical processes. Bradley's jaw was working like he was chewing invisible gum. Even if these patents are legitimate, we can't authorize that kind of expenditure without board approval. Then get board approval. It doesn't work like that. We need to review the formulas, verify their effectiveness, run our own tests. No, I said, beginning to gather up the documents. You'd need to agree to the licensing terms first. The review process happens after you sign, not before. And if you want to run independent tests, you can purchase samples at market rate once the licensing agreement is active. Grayson looked at me like I'd sprouted a second head. Dakota, be reasonable. We can't just write you a check for $200,000 based on patent applications we haven't even verified. I stood, tucked the envelope under my arm. Then I guess we don't have a deal. Wait, the HR woman said, her voice a little frantic. What about your position here? Your salary adjustment. I looked at her like she'd asked me to explain quantum physics to a goldfish. My position here? As of right now, I'm giving my 2 weeks' notice. My last day will be. I checked my phone, enjoying the moment. Friday, October 18th. You can't just quit. Bradley sputtered. You've got projects in progress. Responsibilities. Actually, I can just quit. Oregon is an at-will employment state. And as for my responsibilities? You just told me my work was only worth $38,000 a year. I'm sure you can find someone at that salary level to handle whatever's left. I walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back. Oh, and one more thing. I've already accepted a position with Peakridge Industries. They were very interested in my background in advanced materials engineering. That was a lie, but they didn't need to know that. Grayson's face went crimson. Peakridge is our biggest competitor. You can't work for them. Your non-compete clause doesn't apply to consulting arrangements, I said. I won't be your employee. I'll be an independent contractor, licensing my proprietary technology. Completely different legal framework. I left them sitting there, mouths agape, like they were trying to catch flies. The truth was, I hadn't spoken to PEEKage yet, but I was about to. That afternoon, I researched every major player in the industrial adhesives market. PEEKage Industries was the obvious choice. They had the resources to license my patents and the distribution network to bring them to market fast. But they weren't the only option. 3 companies would kill to get their hands on a cold cure adhesive system: PEEKage, Industrial Solutions Group, and Consolidated Materials. If I played this right, I could spark a bidding war that would make Brightstone's licensing offer look like spare change. I called PEEKage first and asked to speak with their head of research and development, a woman named Catherine Wells, known for aggressive innovation. "Miss Wells, this is Dakota Pierce. I'm a materials engineer with some proprietary technology that might interest your company." "What kind of technology?" she asked, her voice sharp and to the point. "Cold cure structural adhesives that maintain bond strength at minus 40 F." The line went quiet for a moment. Then "That's not possible with current polymer chemistry." "It wasn't possible with current polymer chemistry," I corrected. "I've developed a new catalytic system that changes the game entirely. Can you send me some technical specifications?" "I can do better than that. I can arrange a demonstration. Are you free tomorrow afternoon?" She was. I spent that evening preparing samples of all 4 compounds. Small test batches, just enough to prove the technology worked without revealing the underlying formulas. Each sample went into a labeled vial with basic performance specifications, but no chemical composition data. The next day, I drove to PEEKage headquarters in Beaverton with a cooler full of samples and a head full of confidence. Catherine Wells met me in their main conference room along with 2 other engineers whose names I immediately forgot. "Before we start," I said, setting the cooler on the table, "everything you're about to see is proprietary and patent protected. I'll need signed NDAs from everyone in the room." They signed without argument. The demonstration lasted 2 hours. I showed them how the cold cure adhesive maintained structural integrity at temperatures that turned conventional glues into useless putty. How the corrosion-resistant coating protected steel samples submerged in salt water for months. How the impact-resistant sealant absorbed kinetic energy without cracking or delaminating. By the time I finished, Catherine was leaning forward, elbows on the table, eyes locked on the test samples. "This is revolutionary," she breathed. "How did you develop these formulations?" 3 years of independent research," I said, maintaining eye contact. "All conducted outside my previous employment, fully documented and legally protected." Previous employment. Brightstone Dynamics. One of the other engineers, a guy with thick glasses and coffee stains on his shirt, looked up from the cold cure sample he'd been examining. "Brightstone has been trying to crack sub-zero bonding for years." "You're telling me you solved it by working alone?" "I'm telling you their approach was fundamentally flawed," I clarified. They were trying to modify existing polymer chains instead of developing new catalytic systems. Sometimes you need to start from scratch instead of iterating on failure. Catherine nodded slowly. "What are you looking for?" "Employment, partnership, licensing," I laid it out. "Exclusive rights to manufacture and distribute these compounds under my patents. I retain ownership of the underlying technology and collect royalties on everything sold." "What kind of royalties?" 15% of gross revenue for the cold cure system, 10% for the others. She didn't flinch. "We'd need to verify these formulations at scale, run our own production tests." "Of course," I said. "And you'd provide technical support during scaling and be available for ongoing development, improvements, new applications." I smiled. "That depends on the terms of our agreement." We talked for another hour about production timelines, market analysis, and competitive positioning. By the time I left, Catherine had promised to present my proposal to PEEKage's executive committee within the week. That same evening, I had similar conversations with Industrial Solutions Group and Consolidated Materials. Both companies were intensely interested. Both wanted exclusive licensing deals. Both were willing to pay premium rates for technology that could give them a competitive edge. I was setting up a bidding war, and Brightstone Dynamics wasn't even invited to the party. Friday morning, My last day at Brightstone, I cleaned out my desk and said goodbye to the few colleagues who weren't actively avoiding me like I had something contagious. Most of them had heard rumors about my departure, but didn't know the juicy details. "Are you really going to Peakridge?" asked Janet from Quality Control. "Something like that," I said, dumping the last of my personal items into a cardboard box. "Heard Grayson's been in meetings with legal all week," she added, catching my attention. "Something about patent disputes." "Patent disputes?" "Don't know the details. Just saw a bunch of lawyers coming in and out of the conference room." I finished packing and headed for the elevator. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of Grayson Turner walking toward the legal department with a stack of folders under his arm and a grim expression on his face. Let him scramble, I thought. He'd had 7 years to appreciate what I brought to the table. Now he could spend the next 7 figuring out how to replace it. That weekend, I got calls from all 3 companies. Peakridge offered exclusive licensing at 12% royalties plus a $500,000 signing bonus. Industrial Solutions Group countered with 15% royalties and technical consulting fees. Consolidated Materials wanted to buy the patents outright for $12 million. I turned them all down. Counteroffer, I told Catherine Wells on Monday morning. Non-exclusive licensing to all interested parties at 20% royalties. No signing bonuses. No consulting requirements. I retain full patent ownership and the right to license to additional companies in the future. Non-exclusive, she questioned. But that means we'd be competing with everyone else who licenses the technology. That's correct. Dakota, that doesn't make business sense from our perspective. Why would we invest in scaling production if our competitors have access to the same formulations? Because the company that brings these compounds to market first captures the largest market share, I explained. Because licensing fees are a fraction of what it would cost to develop competing technology. And because in 6 months, when demand exceeds supply, you'll be glad you got in early. She was quiet for a moment. What's the real reason you're structuring it this way? I looked out my loft window toward the Brightstone Dynamics building in the distance. Let's just say I want to maximize the disruptive potential of this technology. By Wednesday, all 3 companies had agreed to my terms. Non-exclusive licensing at 20% royalties, with production beginning within 90 days. Conservative estimates put my annual income somewhere north of $8 million once all 3 companies hit full production capacity. Not bad for a guy who supposedly wasn't worth more than $38,000 a year. Thursday morning, my lawyer called with interesting news. Brightstone Dynamics filed a lawsuit yesterday, Elena said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. They're claiming ownership of your patents based on intellectual property clauses in your employment contract. Do they have a case? I asked. Not based on the documentation you provided, she replied. But they're alleging that you used company resources and company time to develop the formulations. They want an injunction to stop you from licensing the technology while the case is pending. I sat down at my kitchen table and poured myself a cup of coffee. How long does something like that usually take? Could be months, maybe longer if they drag it out. What do they need to prove their case? Evidence that you used Brightstone equipment, materials, or work time to develop the patents. Email records showing you conducted research on company systems. Witness testimony from colleagues who saw you working on related projects during business hours, that kind of thing. I smiled. They're not going to find any of that. How can you be so sure? Because I've been planning for this possibility for 3 years. Every material purchase has a receipt from my personal credit card. Every piece of equipment in my lab has a dated invoice. Every test was conducted after hours and on weekends. I've got security camera footage from my building showing me coming and going at all hours. What about your lab notes from work? Research you did during company time? Different projects entirely, I explained. I was working on heat-resistant compounds for high-temperature applications. The cold cure technology uses completely different chemical principles. There's no overlap. Elena was quiet for a moment. They might try to argue that your work at Brightstone gave you the foundational knowledge to develop the patents. Let them try, I countered. General chemistry knowledge isn't proprietary. They'd have to prove I learned something specific at Brightstone that was essential to developing the cold cure system. Good luck with that. The lawsuit was filed that afternoon. Brightstone Dynamics versus Dakota Pierce, alleging theft of intellectual property and breach of employment contract. They sought monetary damages, transfer of patent ownership, and an injunction preventing me from licensing the technology to anyone. I read through the complaint that evening, highlighting the key allegations. Most of it was legal boilerplate, but a few sections caught my attention. Plaintiff alleges that defendant utilized proprietary knowledge gained during employment to develop competing products in violation of non-disclosure and intellectual property agreements. Defendant's patents were developed using foundational research conducted during work hours using company resources. Defendant's actions constitute unfair competition and tortious interference with business relationships. It was all speculation and legal posturing. They didn't have any actual evidence because there wasn't any to find. But the lawsuit served another purpose. It sent a signal to SMIRKED and the other licensing companies that my patents might not be legally secure. That was a problem I needed to solve quickly. Friday morning, I called a meeting with all 3 licensing partners. We met at a neutral location, a conference room I'd rented at a downtown hotel. Catherine Wells represented SMIRKED. Dean Kim handled things for Industrial Solutions Group. And Consolidated Materials sent their VP of Acquisitions, a sharp-dressed woman named Emery Park. "I'm sure you've all heard about the lawsuit," I said, without preamble. "Brightstone Dynamics is claiming ownership of my patents. I wanted to address this directly rather than let rumors complicate our agreements." Catherine spoke first. "Our legal team is concerned about the injunction. If a judge grants it, we won't be able to proceed with production." "The injunction won't be granted," I stated confidently. "Brightstone doesn't have the evidence to support their claims. But even if they did, it would only delay production, not cancel it." Dean leaned forward. "What kind of evidence could they have?" "None that would hold up in court. The patents were developed independently, using my own resources and my own time. I've got documentation to prove it." Emery looked skeptical. "Employment contracts usually include pretty broad intellectual property clauses. Are you sure there's no overlap?" I pulled out my laptop and opened a presentation I'd prepared that morning. "Let me show you exactly why Brightstone's case is going nowhere." The next hour was probably the most important presentation of my life. I walked them through every aspect of my patent development process, the purchase receipts for equipment and materials, the video timestamps showing after-hours work, the chemical analysis proving my compounds were unlike anything Brightstone had researched. I showed them the fundamental differences between my cold cure technology and the heat-based systems Brightstone had been trying to develop: different catalysts, different polymer chains, different curing mechanisms. The only thing they had in common was that they were both adhesives. By the time I finished, the licensing partners looked satisfied. Catherine actually smiled. "This is exactly what our lawyers needed to see. The documentation is bulletproof." "What's our timeline for production?" Dean asked, energized. "Assuming no further legal delays, we can begin scaling tests within 2 weeks. Full production capacity should be online within 90 days. Emery nodded. "And you're confident about the market demand projections?" "Conservative estimates put the emergency repair market at over 200 million annually," I told them. "The cold cure technology will capture at least 30% of that within the first year." We spent another hour discussing production schedules, marketing strategies, and quality control protocols. By the time the meeting ended, all 3 companies had reaffirmed their commitment to the licensing agreements, despite Brightstone's lawsuit. I drove home feeling better than I had in months. The legal challenge was annoying, but it wasn't going to derail the bigger plan. Brightstone was flailing, trying to salvage their mistake. But they'd already lost the war. That weekend, I got a call from my former research assistant, Tommy Briggs. He'd been moved to a different department after my lab access got restricted, but we'd stayed in touch. "Dakota, you need to know what's happening over here," he said without preamble. "It's a complete ***, though." "How so?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. "They've got 3 different teams trying to reverse engineer your patents. They're working 16-hour days, burning through materials like crazy, and they're not even close." "What about the other projects I was working on?" "Dead in the water. The heat-resistant compound tests have failed 6 times in a row. The high-pressure sealant project got canceled. They're hemorrhaging money trying to replace what you were doing. I felt a twinge of sympathy for my former colleagues. They were good people caught in the middle of a management disaster they didn't create. How's morale? Tommy laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. 3 people have quit in the last 2 weeks. Janet from quality control, Michael from testing, and Dr. Stevens from the polymer lab. Word is spreading that the company is in trouble. What kind of trouble? Financial trouble. The quarterly projections are way off, and they're not hitting the revenue targets promised to the board. Plus, they're spending a fortune on legal fees trying to fight your patents. That was interesting. If Brightstone was having cash flow problems, the lawsuit became even more desperate. They weren't just trying to protect their intellectual property. They were trying to survive. Is Grayson still making the big decisions? For now, yeah. But there are rumors the board is getting restless. The stock price has dropped 15% since news of the lawsuit went public. After I hung up, I sat on my couch, thinking about the bigger picture. Brightstone Dynamics employed about 400 people across 3 facilities. Most of them were decent, hard-working engineers and technicians who didn't deserve to lose their jobs because of management's incompetence. But that wasn't my responsibility. I hadn't created this situation. I just refused to be a victim of it. Monday morning brought news that changed everything. Elena called with an update on the lawsuit that made me sit up straight. Brightstone's legal team made a mistake, she said, and I could practically hear her grin through the phone. They filed their complaint under an emergency motion requesting an immediate injunction. That means they had to provide their evidence up front instead of going through normal discovery. That's good. Very good, because their evidence is pathetic. They've got some emails about general research directions, a few lab reports that don't relate to your patents, and testimony from Grayson Turner claiming you must have used company time because the patents are too sophisticated for someone working alone. That's it. No smoking guns, no actual proof, just speculation and sour grapes. My guess is they rushed the filing to try to scare off your licensing partners before their agreements became final. Did it work? Nope. I talked to the lawyers at Peak Ridge this morning. They're proceeding with full production plans. The other companies are following suit. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. So, what happens next? We file a motion to dismiss the complaint and a countersuit for frivolous litigation. With any luck, this whole thing will be over within a month. That afternoon, I decided to take a victory lap. I drove past the Brightstone Dynamics building just to see if anything looked different. It didn't. Same glass facade, same corporate parking lot, same sign by the front entrance. But knowing what was happening inside made it feel smaller somehow. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk, Grayson." I stared at the message for a moment, then deleted it without responding. 2 days later, Grayson tried calling. I let it go to voicemail. "Dakota, this is Grayson Turner. I think there's been a misunderstanding about your departure from Brightstone. I'd like to discuss a resolution that works for everyone. Please call me back." I deleted that too. The third attempt came as an email sent to my personal account. Dakota, I understand you're upset about the salary adjustment, but there's no need to let this situation escalate further. Brightstone is prepared to offer you a generous settlement in exchange for dropping the patent dispute. We could discuss reinstating your previous salary and even a promotion to senior engineer. Please consider meeting with me to work this out professionally. That one I forwarded to Elena with a single note. Exhibit for our countersuit. She called within an hour. They're panicking. This email basically admits they know their lawsuit is groundless. What kind of settlement are they offering? Doesn't matter. We're not settling. They made their choice when they cut your salary and tried to steal your work. Now they get to live with the consequences. Friday afternoon, I was in my home lab, running quality tests on production samples, when my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw a familiar figure, Bradley Holt, Brightstone's VP of Operations, standing in my hallway with his hands in his pockets. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Bradley, this is a surprise." "Dakota, we need to talk. This lawsuit is getting out of hand." "I'm not the one who filed the lawsuit. Look, maybe Grayson came on too strong with the salary restructuring. Maybe there's room for negotiation. But these patent claims are hurting both our companies." I leaned against the doorframe. How do you figure? The licensing deals you've signed are creating unfair competition. You're using technology developed while you were employed at Brightstone to undercut our market position. Technology one developed on my own time, with my own resources. That's not how intellectual property law works. Anything you create while employed by a company belongs to that company if it's related to your job duties. His face reddened. It's common sense. You can't just walk away from 7 years of employment and take everything you learned with you. I'm not taking anything. I'm licensing technology one developed independently. Technology that wouldn't exist if I'd relied on Brightstone's resources and approval processes. Dakota, be reasonable. We made you an offer to come back at your original salary. We're even willing to discuss a promotion. What more do you want? I looked at him for a moment, this middle manager who'd sat in meetings nodding along while Grayson destroyed my career, and felt nothing but contempt. I want you to leave my property. Wait, just listen. I closed the door in his face. The next week brought the news I'd been waiting for. Elena called Tuesday morning with an update that made my day. Motion to dismiss granted. The judge threw out Brightstone's complaint entirely. Called it speculative and unsupported by credible evidence. They have 30 days to appeal if they want to pursue it further. Will they appeal? Doubtful. Their lawyers know they don't have a case. And appeals cost money they apparently don't have much of. What about our countersuit? That's moving forward. We're asking for legal fees, damages for lost licensing revenue during the dispute, and punitive damages for frivolous litigation. How much are we talking about? Conservative estimate? About $1.2 million. I sat back in my chair and grinned. And if they don't pay? We can garnish their assets, bank accounts, equipment, real estate, whatever it takes to satisfy the judgment. That afternoon, I got a call from Catherine Wells at Peak Ridge with production updates. The first batch of cold cure adhesive is ready for field testing, she said. Our initial quality control results are exceeding specifications. Bond strength at -40 is actually 20% higher than your samples indicated. Why is that? I asked, intrigued. Because the scaling process allows for better catalyst distribution. The larger batch size creates more uniform curing conditions. Our sales team is already getting inquiries from major construction companies. Word is spreading about the sub-zero capabilities. What's your production timeline looking like? Full capacity within 6 weeks. We're projecting about 500,000 units in the first quarter, ramping up to 2 million annually once demand stabilizes. I did the math in my head. At 20% royalties, that meant about $4 million in annual revenue just from Peak Ridge. The other 2 companies had similar projections. My total annual income from the patents was going to be somewhere north of $12 million. Not bad for technology that Brightstone thought was worth exactly $0. That weekend, I treated myself to something I'd wanted for 3 years, a proper laboratory setup. I found a 30,000 square foot space in an industrial park about 10 minutes from downtown Portland. High ceilings, chemical-grade ventilation, reinforced floors that could handle heavy equipment. I signed a 5-year lease and started ordering equipment, real centrifuges, professional-grade spectrometers, temperature-controlled storage systems, everything I dreamed of during those years of working nights and weekends in my converted loft space. This lab wasn't just for my own research. I had plans to start developing the next generation of advanced materials, compounds that would make my current patents look like child's toys. 2 weeks later, Tommy called with news that made my victory even sweeter. Grayson got fired, he said without preamble. Board meeting yesterday. He's out, effective immediately. I set down the beaker I'd been holding and gave him my full attention. What happened? Quarterly earnings report came out. Revenue down 35%, stock price in freefall. And the board finally realized that losing you was the beginning of the end. They brought in some consultant who basically told them that cutting your salary was the dumbest decision in company history. Who's running things now? Interim CEO named Robert Fletcher. He's trying to do damage control, but it might be too late. 3 more people quit this week, including Dr. Stevens. She got hired by Industrial Solutions Group, by the way. That caught my attention. Dr. Stevens was one of the best polymer chemists I'd ever worked with. If Industrial Solutions was hiring Brightstone talent, They were serious about scaling up production of my formulas. What's the mood like over there? Tommy was quiet for a moment. Honestly, people are scared. The rumor mill says layoffs are coming. Maybe even a complete shutdown if they can't turn things around by the end of the year. After I hung up, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and regret. Satisfaction because Grayson Turner had finally faced consequences for his arrogance. Regret because good people were suffering for his mistakes. But that regret didn't last long. I hadn't destroyed Brightstone Dynamics. I just refused to let them destroy me. The difference mattered. Monday morning brought a call I wasn't expecting. Robert Fletcher, Brightstone's new interim CEO, wanted to meet. Mr. Pierce, I know there's been bad blood between you and the company, but I'd like the chance to discuss a path forward that benefits everyone. I'm listening, I replied. Would you be willing to meet for lunch somewhere neutral? I just want an honest conversation about where we go from here. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a restaurant downtown, far enough from both our offices that we wouldn't be overheard by curious employees. Fletcher was in his 50s, gray-haired and soft-spoken. He looked tired, like a man handed a burning building and told to put out the fire with a garden hose. Let me start by saying that Grayson Turner's handling of your situation was completely unacceptable, he said after we'd ordered. The salary reduction was punitive and unprofessional. The patent lawsuit was a mistake that cost us credibility and money we couldn't afford to lose. He paused, looking at me directly. I've reviewed your employment record. 7 years of exemplary performance, multiple innovations that drove significant revenue growth, and a reputation for solving problems other engineers couldn't handle. You are one of our most valuable employees, and we treated you like you were expendable. I sipped my water, waiting for him to get to the point. I want to offer you your job back, he finally said. Senior engineer position, $120,000 annual salary, full benefits, and a $50,000 signing bonus to make up for the disruption you've experienced. I almost laughed. $120,000? That's a 22% increase over your previous salary, he said, trying to look hopeful. Mr. Fletcher, I said, my voice calm but firm. My current annual income from patent licensing is projected at about $12 million. You're offering me 1% of what I'm already making. His face fell. I wasn't aware the licensing deals were that lucrative. There's a lot Grayson didn't tell the board, apparently. Fletcher was quiet for a moment, pushing salad around on his plate. What would it take to bring you back? Not as an employee, as a consultant or partner. Someone who could help us develop new products and rebuild our research capabilities. It would take a time machine, I told him, so I could go back and prevent your company from trying to destroy my career. Dakota, I understand you're angry. I'm not angry, I said, and realized it was true. I was angry 6 months ago when you started freezing me out. I was angry when Grayson cut my salary. But now? Now I'm just successful. The patent licensing is going very well. So, what do you think? If you were in my shoes, if someone tried to steal your future and then came crawling back, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments below. I really want to hear your thoughts.